Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back. In an earlier podcast episode, Sarah Churchwell said that the United States does well in telling stories about the things that unify us, but less well in telling the stories that divide us. And I'd like to add another story to the list of things that we're not always so great at talking about or telling about, and that's the history of socialism. All too often, socialism is equated to the Soviet Union or Chinese politics of one-party systems that suppress democracy. And too often we think about the Cold War instead of, say, the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, when Karl Marx was at his most prolific. And when we think about Marx, we think of Germany and Britain and France. We don't necessarily think of the United States. But socialism, the idea, came to America before the Civil War and influenced the politics of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in profound ways, from the populists of Texas to the Grange in the plains to the trade unionists in the cities. There was also the Socialist Labor Party, a dedicated socialist party that began in 1876, the same date that so many of us consider to be the start of the Gilded Age. Now, like any political party, the SLP was intellectually diverse, and members had varying ideas on how to bring about the socialist revolution. One of the main divisions centered on the idea of race and who was fit to bring about socialist reform. Wasn't the struggle of humankind the struggle of class? What did Marx say about race? To help us answer these questions and explore the Socialist Labor Party of America, I'm joined by Lorenzo Costaguta, a professor of history at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. Lorenzo has been studying this topic for some time and has written articles and book chapters on the Second International and Chinese immigration in the United States as it relates to socialist movements. I am delighted to welcome him to the show and to discuss his debut book, Workers of All Colors Unite: Race and the Origins of American Socialism. Welcome to the show, Lorenzo.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great. And this is a fantastic book for so many reasons. I don't often want to start off the show with definitions, but I thought for today's discussion, it's probably best to get some definitions out of the way.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start off with socialism. And I don't mean that in the abstract sense of the word, but really, what is American socialism? Is it Marxist? I know it's not just about the labor movement, because you talk about that in your book, but can you explain in your own words what American socialism is?
It's a difficult thing to do, because I mean, what I try to say in the book is that we shouldn't be focusing on like a simple version of American socialism as if it was something different than what we understand socialism to be. But then trying to define what socialism is actually quite complicated. If you look historically, you can kind of see, especially for the 19th century, it's very wrong to focus exclusively on Marxism as what socialism is, because socialism means many different things to different people. You have maybe a European origin of it, but then, as I also show in the book, but as you know very well, people go from Europe to America and then they make socialism their own way on the basis of what they find in the country. For the United States, socialism can be constructed as something that is political, but also moral. It's linked to a specific understanding of the individual, what the individual can do, should be doing, what the state can do. So I think that's it's very much philosophical and political at the same time. In my book, I try to define and to understand it as something that is a political movement, and that could be a starting point. But then I'm sure that then we'll define better what we mean by that.
Obviously, the context matters so much for this, and what I'm interested in is your explanation of how socialism and socialist ideology spread in the United States. And for this, I want to bring in the German immigrants because they play such a big part in your story. So how do they make socialism resonate across the United States?
Germans, they arrive in the United States. I mean, there are two things I would say that is important to stress in this context. The first is they arrive to in the United States, and like many immigrants, they need to find a place in the society. And to an extent, they come with a baggage, and the baggage is socialism, but it's also like a set of Republican ideas, small r, of course, and a set of understanding of what democracy is, what citizenship is, and they bring all these ideas, but then they find different ideologies and different ways of like dealing with the state, as we were saying, and dealing with politics in general. And so from their perspective, bringing socialism means bringing an understanding of how you interact with the state, but also finding a way of like organizing social relationships. So this is the way in which they bring this ideology in the country. They do that in specific contexts. It's more, as you know, I mean, my book is more a history about urban contexts than the rural, because that's where they go. That's where they are employed, especially those that are affiliated with the Socialist Labor Party, which is essentially the protagonist of my book. They tend to live in these contexts. And so for them, it's really trying to understand how they can organize also municipalities on the basis of their ideology.
And the Germans, though, have a very specific way of spreading the message, right? Don't they? That's perhaps different maybe than some other immigrant communities. And that seems to be the focus of your book, too. It's the press, right? I mean, how important is the press for socialism?
It's absolutely crucial. The press is the means, that's the point I make in the book. The press really is the means through which socialism is spread. We are talking about local newspapers. We are talking about very often weekly, sometimes daily newspapers. You see this pattern whenever they manage to put together like a socialist and SLP branch, the first thing that they want to do is start a newspaper. Even if there are already so many newspapers around, but that's really the way in which they think they can have their message known around. They can shape better their message. That's where they talk. That's where they converse. So it's a site of conversation, and there is a mechanism, and you can see that you take the article and then you find the article in another newspaper. There is like a circulation of the news that is very spread through this local press that is all linked to the party, but it's also very independent. There's no full control by the party of what is being published in this press. There's always the attempt from the center of the party to try and control it, to try and have a national paper that kind of sets the line, the political line of the party, but that actually very rarely happens. It only happens at the end of the book in the 1890s. It's quite interesting to like know the fact that Daniel de Leon, that is probably one of the most known leader of the SLP, he's never been the secretary of the party. He was in charge of the English press. That was the position that gave him the power within the party, because the press is so important to define what the party is doing as an organization.
And the decentralization of the newspapers is great too, because that explains, we're going to get into that a little bit about the different metropolitan areas that your book covers. I want to bring in the other major intersecting thing of your book, which is race. You know, this book is about race and American socialism. And the first question I have about race is about the various versions of racial ideologies that are at play here. And what I loved about your book was the pains that it takes to show the differences among racialized ideologies or ideas of race. There's Darwinism, but you also reference Lamarckianism, which is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the idea that generations can change, or things can change within a generation. You also reference anthropological and sociological theories. All of these have their proponents. How do the versions of racialized thinking, how do they intersect with other major dividing lines in your book about class, modernity, capitalism? And I know this is like an immense question that I'm rambling on about, but I also know that you have the answers for this because you wrote a book that that talks about all these intersections. So take it away, Lorenzo.
I'll do my best. Yeah, this is essentially the core of my book. What I've been trying to do is explaining how these different ideologies that you have that try to answer the fundamental question that many, not just intellectuals, but many people at the time are asking, which is like a question about racial diversity, about the different groups that the human race is made of, and how that came into being. So all these different theories that you have, social Darwinism, that are two different things, geographical determinism, anthropology, these are all different answers that are proposed at the time. What the point that I'm trying to make and the conversation that I'm trying to reconstruct is essentially from a socialist point of view, from the point of view of like these people that define themselves as socialists. Their urgency is to try to explain how socialism can be compatible with these theories. And because they see these theories as like the cutting edge scientific ideas of the time. And essentially the thinking is, since socialism is also from their point of view like a science, they need to be combined in some way. This is not a question that only American socialists are asking, of course. I mean, Karl Kautsky starts his career as an intellectual as essentially a scientist of evolutionism. And he spends a lot of time and a lot of pain, and Bernstein is the same. I mean, there are so many European intellectuals that are asking the same questions. But they have distinct conversations. And what is happening in the US, I argue, is peculiar, because the US is a country, as we know very well, that has so much internal racial and ethnic diversity. So it's not just an intellectual question, it's a question that needs to be answered because there are decisions to be taken on the workplace. There are decisions in the different contexts in which this conversation is going on, but there are decisions to be taken by the party on how to behave with these different minorities that you have in the workplace. What do you do with them? So from the point of view of the socialists, it's trying to make their doctrine appealing for this context in which talking about racial diversity is so important, but at the same time, making it compatible with something that goes beyond capitalism. You mentioned capitalism, and that's the big question. I mean, social Darwinism, the genius of social Darwinism is making a conversation about racial difference compatible with the way in which you organize society and compatible with capitalism as well. From the point of view of socialists, the point is understanding how you make racial difference compatible with something that goes beyond capitalism. So how you make racial difference compatible with socialism, essentially.
I love this because your book, it makes a very clear distinction between the intellectual arguments around socialism and then the labor movement as well, which is a more practical, I suppose, reaction to industrial capitalism. So what effect do these intellectual debates, what effect does it have on the labor movement in America?
I suggest that the way in which the conversation is organized is very much, and I mean, ultimately what I try to argue in the book is that if you look at race, you can really understand much of the thinking that is going on the workplace and within the labor movement. So you can really use race as a lens to interpret different ways and different politics within the Socialist Party and surely beyond that. I argue that there are two main approaches that can be recognized, two areas of opinion that can be recognized, that try to find an answer to the question that I was asking before. How do you make racial difference compatible with socialism, with an anti-capitalist approach? And how do you organize your response on the workplace? And the two main approaches are, on the one side, internationalism, working class internationalism, and on the other side, I define this scientific rationalism. So the first answer is probably the one that might be a bit more known, which is a sort of a standard socialist answer to this problem, which is essentially in the conversation between race and class, what we really need to be focusing on is class. Race is an artifice, is an ideology that has been created by capitalists to divide the working class. So we need to be focusing on what puts us together as workers, which is our positionality as worker in the capitalist system. And we have a commonality of interest, and we need to be focusing on that. And that comes with an answer, and the answer is we shouldn't be focusing on the ballot box. We shouldn't be focusing on voting. We should be focusing on what we can do on the workplace. So small incremental improvements on the workplace that we can achieve through trade unions. So our means should be to be focusing on trade unions in the first place, because that's where we can improve our living conditions and build socialism. On the other side, there are the scientific rationalists that want to answer to the questions and kind of believe more, are more supporters of a variety and a patchwork, really, of pseudoscientific theories like social Darwinism or anthropology or geographical determinism, that essentially say that we need to recognize that evidence and we need to square that and make socialism appealing on the ballot box. And we need workers to vote for us. And that's the main way in which we can achieve socialism. So on this side of the conversation, there is a lot of like trying to square the circle, trying to go after the voters that, depending on where you are and depending the moment, but they tend to have white supremacist positions. It's quite evident, for example, in California in the 1870s or in the 1880s, when you have a small percentage of Chinese workers that everyone is going against. And for the socialists there, the point is trying to understand how you can obtain the vote of these white workers that are very much against Chinese immigration. And for them, then, there is an attempt to kind of put together sort of racial egalitarianism with a socialist theory, but the two are so incompatible that these intellectual devices that they put together are not really tenable ultimately. But in trying to go deeper into the conversation there, you can understand how these theories of race are really racializing socialist ideology in this moment in the Gilded Age, not just in the US, but in my book, I deal with the US.
Well, what I like so much about this is that it really clarifies a lot of the, not just the intellectual debates that are going on within socialism during the Gilded Age and Progressive era, but the actual struggles that they're having to put their ideas into practice. And I'm going to come back to that later on in the show. I want to ask you about the American left today, but before we get there, you've mentioned the Socialist Labor Party as being the protagonist of your book, and it is. And I think we owe it a little bit of time here to explain what the Socialist Labor Party is, when it starts, because it starts in 1876, which many of us see as the beginning of the so-called Gilded Age, right? So it's critically important for that. And I want to talk a little bit about one of its early leaders, the Texan Adolph Dewey, or Dewey, I think his name is pronounced.
Dewey, yeah.
Dewey, okay. So what is the Socialist Labor Party, and who is Adolph Dewey?
So the Socialist Labor Party is the party that comes out of like a set of different small socialist parties that you have during Reconstruction, Illinois, New York, and they are scattered across the Midwest and the North. And they all federate together in 1876 with a different name. So the first name is Working Men's Party of the United States. That is changed to Socialist Labor Party in 1877. It's one of the organizations that filter into the SLP is also the First International. The First International ends its life in New York, and it's like officially closed down by Friedrich Sorge, that is the last secretary of the First International, that then transitions into the Working Men's Party of the United States. It is a party that is founded on the back of what is going on in Germany, when there is a union between the Marxists and the Lassalleans, and German-American socialists, they federate together, they gather in Philadelphia in 1876, that when you're celebrating the centennial of the nation, and they put together this party. That is essentially the leading socialist organization throughout the Gilded Age. It's a party that is slightly bigger when it's founded, and it becomes very, very small in the 1880s, and then it picks up again in the 1890s. It continues to exist. It probably still exists today. I mean, it's like
I looked it up. It does still exist today.
it does. I think that up until a certain time, there was like a group somewhere in California that was meeting. Now I don't even know if there is that, but officially still exists. So it's a very long-standing feature of the American political scenario. It continues to have some influence throughout the 20th century. But yeah, I mean, Adolf Douai is one of the leaders I focus on, which is less talked about than others that I mentioned in the book. But he's such a fascinating character. It's throughout the book I kept like stumbling into him and it's not really present in the literature. He's from Germany, from what is now the eastern part of Germany, born in 1819. He lives in around the area of like Leipzig, essentially, for the first part of his life, and then he arrives, moves to the United States in the 1850s. He arrives in 1853, and the first place where he lands is actually Texas. He drives like a group of German immigrants to Texas. That is now becoming like a beacon for many German immigrants that are staying in West Texas in that moment. The problem is that the guy, when he arrives in Texas, decides to found an abolitionist paper, and vehemently anti-slavery paper. And he manages to stay in Texas for like a couple of years, 3 years precisely. And then his abolitionist activity forces him out of Texas. Texans don't take it lightly, the fact that he's going against slavery. And then he has like a life as an activist in a variety of labor movements in the late 1850s and in the 1860s. And he becomes one of the figures that then joins the Working Men's Party of the United States and the SLP. And he's one of the main leaders of the party until his death in 1886. He really is a leader that, for the argument of the book, is very important because he represents a specific strand of intellectual thought. He grows up intellectually in the German-speaking area in a moment in which all these, like pre-Darwinian moment, in a moment in which there are different theories to talk about racial difference that are very much connected to language, they're connected to geology, they're connected to geographical determinism. But then when Darwinism arrives, he puts Darwinism in the mix. So he writes extensively about racial diversity, is probably one of the most prolific socialist writers about the subject in the period. But his theory is very much a patchwork of different approaches that rarely coexist. But what is interesting is that he really embraces the idea of like a scientific approach to racial diversity, but at the same time is very progressive. Is pro-immigration, is racial egalitarian. He speaks in favor of Chinese immigration. He speaks in favor of Black Americans. Is one of the few that is actually looking at African Americans in detail in this period, but from the perspective of someone embracing theories of race. So that's really the contradiction that that I try to unpack in the book. And I try to explain where these very contradictory characters are coming from.
And it wasn't that uncommon at the time within socialist circles. There is another side, though, too, that you take up in your book as well, the anti-Darwinists among the Socialist Labor Party. Who are they?
So the anti-Darwinists are essentially the ones that are saying that Darwin, scientific understandings of race, they really have nothing to do with conversations about the workplace, conversations about politics, and conversations about all these issues. The intellectual root is Marx and Engels. I mean, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they are kind of interested in looking at what is going on with Darwinism. They like the fact that Darwin is essentially destroying any sort of religious understanding of evolution. They love that because I think that they understand that as the missing piece that can destroy the artifice of like religion as something that explains the origins of the world. But at the same time, they're not really interested in what Darwin has to say about about mankind, and about like social interaction. They understand that as a completely different conversation. And the anti-Darwinian are the internationalists, the ones that want to focus on class, the ones that want to stay away from the conversation about race, and they want people and workers to focus exclusively on class. A position that is very progressive in the context of the Gilded Age, but also a position that has problems, many problems that kind of remain in the history of the American left, but not just the American left.
I couldn't help thinking when I was reading this about Darwin and Marx being two of the most important writers and thinkers, I suppose, of the 19th century, and that this is how schisms develop in politics. And that's really what I love about your book, is how ideas come into practice as well. And you mentioned Chinese exclusion. Listeners will know a good deal about this. I spoke several months ago to Ben Railton about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we talked a great deal about race and exclusion, but one area that we didn't delve into was around socialism. How do socialists go from, as you say, this kind of traditional class only matters viewpoint and race doesn't feature, to full-on exclusion of the Chinese?
The answer to that is that socialists try to have it both ways. So they try to kind of put the two perspectives together, and they try, their approach is shaped by a set of facts. Socialists are mostly gathered in the East and in the Midwest. The party is mostly there, and then there are some militants that are actually on the West Coast. It's a small group that has the potential to grow. When the 1877 strike kind of explodes, and you have like something going on in San Francisco as well, the SLP is at the real center of that protest. So it actually is sparked by a protest organized by the SLP in 1877. But then that protest turns into an anti-Chinese mob that lasts 3 days. And the protests by the SLP was not about that at all, but that kind of is telling of what is going on. From the socialists, it's they are very fascinated by the fact that the workers are having such a strong voice in local politics. So the Working Men's Party of California, that is not the Working Men's Party of the United States, it's another organization. They have a role. They managed to elect the San Francisco mayor. They kind of go on having a big influence. They're fascinated by the fact that workers seem to be so present in local politics. The problem is that they are so present because of their anti-Chinese message. So from the point of view of the socialists, and like the theories that you find articulated there, they kind of pick on the fact that Chinese workers are an exploited minority. And Chinese workers find themselves in that position because of the way in which capitalist exploitation works. They also pick on the fact that there is a specific dynamic of exploitation for the Chinese minority that is linked to the fact that they are organized in a community that is very close-knit, and that in which the American authorities don't have a way into. So the trip are organized by specific organizations. All the public services, they are run by these Chinese companies, the 6 companies that are doing everything. They are kind of organizing every single aspect of this community. And they realize that that is that exploitative dynamic. But what is strange is that rather than appealing to their class internationalism and saying, okay, this is an exploited minority that we need to try and organize, what they do instead, race intervenes in that dynamic, and it kind of steps in as a concept that tells socialists that Chinese workers cannot be organized because they belong to another culture, and there's no possibility of dialogue between the white workers and the Chinese workers. They speak another language. They look different. They don't have the same kind of concept. They don't think in the same way. So even some of the progressive voices that you have in the party, when you get to solutions, what they say is, we cannot really do anything for Chinese workers here. We need to send them back. And then try to build socialism in China, which sounds like the classic. I mean, you hear so many politicians these days, like, help them out their place. That as long as they are not around, that's fine. We just give some money and everything will be okay. So it sounds a bit like that. Some of them are genuine in their belief that there are different level of developments across the world, and we cannot really interact with Chinese people at this moment. It's an articulate, like a justification of a racist position to a certain extent, but it's a justification that makes a lot of sense in the intellectual context of the time. And from the point of view of like making socialist, having it both way is not really successful, because again, it's an argument that you can apply to contemporary politics. If you have someone that wants to vote for a exclusionary white supremacist party, they're not going to vote for like the socialists that pretend to be that. They're going to vote for the original. They're not going to listen to the one that comes from a different perspective that tries to articulate similar points. They will go with the one, the original one. So the Working Men's Party of California was very successful. The SLP trying to be like that was not really successful. But there is this strange mentality that is important to understand to figure out how race works.
Speaking about this reminds me that the divisions over nationalism and internationalism within the socialist movement as well. And when you take that option away for the Chinese to leave, to go back to China, to be excluded from the American nation, you can't do that with other groups, however. And I'm thinking here about African Americans, where there are very different perspectives among socialists. And what your book does an excellent job at is showing the different metropolitan centers across the country: New Orleans, Chicago, St. Louis, and how African Americans and how Marxists felt about African Americans, or how integration and class factored there. So I don't know, is there a question on that? But maybe just to say that the Marxist and the socialist doctrine is fairly diverse, and it's not really all that straightforward, is it? And maybe absolutely. The question is how does it differ from city to city?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a chapter specifically dedicated to that. And in that chapter, I adopted like a local history approach, also out of the fact that if you try and look for like a general approach that the party had, you don't find it. It's simply not there. There is no like a clearly theorized policy and a clearly theorized approach to how to deal with African Americans in this period. That's something that then gets developed later on, as we know. I mean, in the 20th century, you have like a much full-fledged developed conversation about the problem. During the Gilded Age, that conversation, according to what I found, is simply not there. You have a set of different approaches on the basis of where the party is stronger and on the basis of where they try to interact more regularly with African Americans. The broad picture is a picture in which the socialists are very strong in some cities in the north and in the Midwest, where the African American population during the Gilded Age is still tiny, very, very small. So the reality is like for places like New York, for example, even though they were very close geographically, there is no regular interaction. I mean, the party stays within the German American community that is like so large. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. That is like a broad enough horizon for them. But then this part, and in the South, the socialists are almost not present at all. So in the Deep South, there is, apart from New Orleans, that's the only exception, there's no significant socialist presence in this moment. But the pattern breaks up in some cities on the Mason-Dixon line, especially Cincinnati, St. Louis, a bit of Chicago as well, and New Orleans, as I was saying. In these different contexts, there are essentially many missed opportunities in the sense of like there is a context in which a party that was looking better after what was happening in the African American communities would have had the chance to have like an in-way in communities that tend to be maybe separated, but are very much in need of a message that is defending rights, civil rights and workers' rights on the workplace. It happens, for example, when you have enlightened leaders like Peter H. Clark, who is one of the first African-American socialists that we know well about, who is a member of the SLP at the end of the 1870s. He has a long history as activist, especially in the Republican Party, on behalf of the local community of Cincinnati. And he joins the SLP at the end of the 70s on the back of the 1877 strike, because he thinks that socialism is a movement that can help genuinely African Americans with their problems. And he articulates a message in which race and class goes together in a way that is coherent and full-fledged and developed. He essentially says that in the United States, the message about class inequality is articulated in racial terms. So he links like racial difference with the problems that workers have in the United States. And he offers an analysis that is much more developed than many of the other leaders in the party. But at the same time, he's also an example of what doesn't work in this moment. And what doesn't work is the fact that the party is way too focused on other dynamics. It's way too focused on immigrants. It's way too focused on like battles of local politics in which the problems of African Americans are not put at the center of their political activity. So from this point of view, the example of St. Louis is probably even more telling, because St. Louis in the 1870s, that's the main way through which African Americans that are in the South are kind of trying to make their way to places like Kansas, to try and leave the South that is becoming so incredibly racist in its social and legal infrastructure. And socialists in that moment are very strong at the end of the 70s. They had the chance to help this group of people that was going through St. Louis on their way to Kansas, but they really don't pick on that. Again, they're too focused on the other dynamics. They're struggling with the Irish. They're trying to kind of establish a sort of like supremacy, or at least their place in the local politics, and they don't look at what is going on in the African American community. So you have like these two boats, like going in the dark, but not really talking to one another.
Yeah, as you say, missed opportunities. And I was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the SLP's view on Native Americans in the same period. How does that add to the discourse, the intellectual discourse around socialism and social Darwinism, racial hierarchies, ideologies of race?
Socialists have a rather extensive conversation about Native Americans and about their place in the American society. It's not as extensive as the conversation on Chinese immigrants, which is by far the most talked about problem in this period. But talking about Native Americans is a way, from a socialist point of view, to really get to a clarification of the relationship between socialism and these different theories of diversity that you have going on out there at the time. The approach is like split into two. From one point of view, you have an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial rhetorical message that is developed and articulated in the socialist press, that essentially says that in the conversation about civilization and savagism that is so widespread at the time, and in the almost universal embracing of the idea that white society is civilized and Native American society is barbaric, savage, uncivilized, socialists use the same terminology to flip the script and to make the point that it is actually capitalism to be the savage here. It's capitalism that is turning men and women into savage with its obsession with the dynamic of like earning and focusing on like wealth and the way in which the individualism and so on and so forth. That's what turned the American society into a savage society. Whereas Native Americans that are untouched by capitalism are the ones that are more civilized. They're more humane. They remained. There is a bit of like Rousseau's like noble savage here going in the background, but not necessarily. It's very much anti-colonial and anti-imperialist as a conversation. It's not linked, and again, you can frame this in terms of like missed opportunities, not linked as you would expect with like a critique of railroads or like the capitalist exploitation that is ongoing at the time that is physically destroying Native American cultures at the time, even though there is that connection, but it's not full-fledged. But at the same time, you also have on the side the conversation going about understanding this Native American like society's reality and what is going on in the framework that is very dominant at the time. So like as a vanishing culture, as a vanishing population that is left behind, but this modernity that is ultimately unstoppable. The two things go together. And in that context, what socialists talk extensively about, they use a lot of anthropology here. So they cling to Lewis H. Morgan a lot, and they use that as a way to frame their understanding of Native Americans as a human group that is not advanced, it's not different in racial terms, but it's less advanced from a social and a cultural point of view. So that's the framing that they have. You don't really have any sort of like attempt to break away from the Western centrism of like an idea that sees modernity in one single way. There's no really break away from like modernity and progress as something that is linked to industrialization. For many, it's a real struggle to see things in a different way. And surely you don't have any sort of like cultural pluralism of the type that you find with Franz Boas or like with the intellectuals that come later at the beginning of the 20th century.
And there's the practical elements of it as well that you point out as well, that, you know, taking on multiple causes means detracting or maybe, dispersing yourself too thinly politically. So it makes a lot of sense. In the 1890s, your book sort of moves on towards the later stages of your book to the 1890s, and the Socialist Labor Party faces a split. Mm-hmm. What's the intellectual division? And you mentioned Daniel de Leon before, but he really comes into focus as a key personality in this split. So who's de Leon? Why is he important? And what's the split all about?
So de Leon is a leader that its success is built on the fact that his biography is kind of perfect for the type of organization that the SLP has become in the 1890s. De Leon is born in 1852 in Curacao, is that at the time a small island in front of Venezuela, is part of the Dutch Empire. So he is born in an imperial context as a member of the Jewish local community. So like an enclave within an enclave in a broader empire. He's educated in Europe, classical education. He studies law, he studies Latin, ancient Greek and all that. He learns a lot of languages. And then in the 1870s, he moves to the United States. He's like a cosmopolitan thinker that when he arrives in the United States, he throws himself into politics while building a career as an expert in law in several universities in New York. He's at Columbia in the 1880s. Is a supporter of Grover Cleveland for a while. Then he kind of goes with Henry George, kind of goes through a set of different movements in the 1880s. And then he gets to socialism at the end of the 1880s via the nationalist clubs of Edward Bellamy. So it gets is like American way to socialism, but then he meets Marxism and he turns into like a very hardcore supporter of Marxism. And he joins the SLP in the 1890s. And when he gets into the party, the fact that he has this cosmopolitan background, the fact that he's part of the American intelligentsia, the fact that he speaks so many languages, so he can interact with the different immigrant communities that you have in the party at the time. He speaks German, he's Jewish, so he can speak with the Jews unions that are so important in the party at the time. But at the same time, he frames himself as American. So the contribution that he brings to the SLP is very much in line with what the party is turning itself into the 1890s. There is a moment of realization at the end of the 1880s that the party is too immigrant, is too closed in the German American community, and it needs to be more like much more English speaking, and it can bring that. So in the 1890s, the SLP does become much more Americanized, if you want to use that term. It doesn't lose the connection with all the immigrant communities that are really the powerhouse of the party, but it tries to kind of carve its own way between being very much more attuned with English-speaking workers while retaining the support of the immigrant communities. And this comes with a clarification also on the position about race and on the conversation between the two poles that I was talking about, the internationalists and the scientific rationalists. The position embraced in the 1890s is very much a position focused on class. So class is the unifying factor on which we should be focusing on. But at the same time, there is an attention to what is going on in terms of racial diversity. And there is a systematization of the different adhesions to the various theories that I was talking about. Again, Morgan becomes very, very important. From this point of view, what we were saying about Native Americans is useful because it helps explaining what the position is. It's there's no racial diversity, but there are different levels of social and cultural development. And that's the position that we hold, but we want to bring everyone at the same stage and take them to socialism. So it becomes a bit more coherent, the situation. The problem is that by the end of the 1890s, you get to a situation in which De Leon, that has done some good things for the party, is also incredibly controversial and incredibly, to an extent, narrow-minded leader. He again squanders a lot of opportunities of engaging more closely with the American Federation of Labor, with the populists in this period, with the Knights of Labor, because he has a very adamant and specific understanding of Marxism, and he wants to pursue in that way. And this position becomes untenable and very problematic, and it's holding the socialist movement back at this point. Because in the meantime, you have the American capitalism developing, but also hitting so many stumble blocks, crises. The crisis of the 1890s started in 1893, is a moment of growth for the American socialist movement, but a moment that would require more interaction with other approaches in other parties, especially the populist movement that is making an inroad and has become so strong in the South, in the Southwest, in the Midwest, and in other parts of the country. De Leon doesn't see that. The SLP at the end of the 90s has become too small for what the socialist movement can be. And that's what leads to the split at the end of the 1899, which is a physical, very type of clash that happens during a congress of the party, chairs smashed on people's head and things like that. And it's very quite interesting to read about that. But then it leads to the SLP becoming a smaller party and the foundation of the Socialist Party of America, led by Eugene Debs, that then leads the socialist movement during the Progressive era.
So I'm going to get to Debs and the Socialist Party of America. Just to say, when I was looking up the Socialist Labor Party, the one that still exists today calls themselves De Leonists.
Yeah.
So they very much see themselves, and that's the party. I think that's a great point, that they didn't really connect with populism. I mean, we have a podcast on the show about populism in Texas. It just didn't take off in the rural parts of America. It was an urban immigrant party, and De Leon missed a beat. All right, let's move on to the Socialist Party of America. 1901, the year, has always struck me as one of the most important years on record. There's books about this. There's 1848 or 1968 or 1492. To me, there should be a book about 1901. And in that year, the Socialist Party of America is formed in Indiana by Eugene V. Debs, as you mentioned. How does this change the dialogue on race in America and within the socialist movement?
I mean, I make the point that much of what you see in the SLP during the Gilded Age, you keep seeing in the SPA. So there is a continuity. that debate between different positions on the verge of like theories of race versus internationalism, that kind of stays around during the SPA period. So you have, the SPA is a much broader tent. You have leaders from several parts of the country, leaders with different, a variety of backgrounds and history and historical baggage behind them. You have leading like immigrant leaders like Victor Berger, Oscar Ameringer in Oklahoma, but at the same time you had Eugene Debs, that despite the immigrant origins of his parents, is very much Americanized and very much a Midwestern type of figure. So you have a lot. You have for a moment W.B. Du Bois, Hubert Harrison, leaders, African American leaders that see socialism like a possibility for the African American minority. But what you see is like an attempt. For example, I mean, I focus a bit in the conclusions of the book. I focus a bit on the founding Congress of 1901, because the founding Congress is attended by several African American members that make the point that there should be a specific blank on African American working class, and that they would require like a special, separate type of message for them because their situation is specific, and it comes on the back of slavery and it comes on the back of Reconstruction. So the SPA allows for separate messages. In that conversation, there's also some members that say, no, we shouldn't be like dealing in specific appeals to specific group of the population because we are all part of the same working class. But the position that we have maybe now achieved within, I mean, that now it's much more present, at least in terms of like, no, we are not all the same. We need to have like different approaches on the basis of like historically what specific parts of the population have gone through. That is a position that finds much more room in the SPA, even though there is no full clarification on what to do on the problem, not just with African Americans, but on race in general. There continues to be some degree of confusion and different approaches depending on the different parts of the country on like how to square class and race as two poles that create inequality in the American capitalist system.
Okay, Lorenzo, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about why this matters for today. One of the things that the podcast tries to do is explain how the Gilded Age and Progressive Era has a legacy, and and the history is important for today. I was thinking about when we started talking about one of the major criticisms of the American left today, and certainly American socialism, is that the ideas are too diverse, they're too divergent at times. I don't think that's entirely true about race, but it's certainly true within the party, and how things are put into practice is a major bone of contention. What are the lessons for socialists today that we can draw from your book and from the study of socialism in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era?
Some of them are like very much connected to the type of debate that I was talking about, in the sense of probably there is a general agreement now on the fact that a class-only message doesn't really cut through, doesn't work, doesn't make any sense. You need to have an emphasis on race. You need to understand that different racial minorities have different types of political needs that need to be addressed specifically. There is a message that, I don't know, perhaps in the United States is 100% clear, but if you step outside the United States, that's not clear at all. I mean, I'm from Italy, I live in the UK. Each kind of these countries have a different conversation about this topic, and there are parts even of Europe. I mean, if we did this same conversation in Italy, we would need to approach the conversation in a completely different way. And what I just said wouldn't be clear at all for any organization on the left. So that's something that needs to be said, and it's very, very important. I think that another thing that you can take out of my book that is very important for contemporary politics is there is so much confusion about what socialism is. So much. It's very much linked to communism, Stalin, the USSR, and the Cold War, and all that. Whereas socialism is actually something different, and it's very much, I mean, the main incarnations of socialism, you cannot have like a single definition, but the main incarnations of socialism, they tend to be 90% democratic, very much compatible with democracy, very much focused on like improving human well-being in general. And so we need to have a better understanding of what socialism is to have a conversation that makes sense in the contemporary context. One last thing that I want to mention is I think that the book tells quite, I mean, for someone that is interested in the history of the left and from someone that comes from the left politically as well, the book, I hope, is not, doesn't like paint a great picture. I mean, these socialists were not very good on understanding what was going on at the time.
It does not paint a very good picture of them.
No, exactly. So it's like they had so many problems, and it's like they were not doing a great job. But there is on this, a couple of things can be said. The first is that historically, there are moments in which the articulation of like progressive idea is simply impossible because the context doesn't allow you to do that. And that's something that you kind of need to understand when you study different periods of history. That doesn't mean that the idea that you have is wrong. It means that the landscape is one of a kind. And so you kind of need to understand what the landscape is telling you, and you kind of need to take that message historically and see how it has developed across time. And the Gilded Age is a specific moment that needs to be understood in the context of the time, because otherwise you're kind of lost.
Well, that sort of validates my first question about why we need to start with definitions and contextualization. So, yeah, Lorenzo, thanks so much for joining me on the show. Your book is fantastic. It's called Workers of All Colors Unite, Race and the Origins of American Socialism. And I'm so delighted that you joined me on the show.
Thank you very much for the question. It has been great to talk with you.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.